Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History, where we read through the great book that Mike Allen and I wrote, Patriot's History of the United States. And this, of course, is brought to you by thewildworldofhistory.com, where you'll find a full curriculum in U.S. and world history. And remember, every lesson not only has written work, not only has the great readings, but also has me teaching every single lesson in high production video. And remember, these lessons do not expire. They're yours. Once you have them, you can use them with as many kids as you want. Remember, I have a political show following this one that is for insiders only at my Wild World of Politics site. You want to check that out because there's a ton of stuff for insiders. There's the Reagan series. There's the series on American exceptionalism. I have the new globalism series coming up soon in the summer. You're going to want to check all that stuff out. You get full access to just all of my stuff. And of course, you get my political commentary Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 o'clock. And lastly, remember, we're trying to turn Patriot's History into a video series. I need your help. Go to wildworldofhistory.com and watch the incredible trailer. We had people coming in going, I cried watching that trailer. Yes, you will cry. It's an amazing 4-minute history of America. And after you view the trailer, buy me a coffee. Buy me 10 copies. Buy me 1,000 copies if you want to be a real investor and help make this video series. But we're trying to make Patriot's History into a video series. All right, let's get started. As always, I will be reading from the 15th anniversary edition of Patriot's History of the United States. As always, if you have an earlier edition, most of the stuff is the same, but the page numbers may be a little off. You may have to search around for the headers. That's why I always give you the header. And last time we were looking at Boston's Tea Party, and I am on page, I can't even see for the light, 75. Page 75, and I am in the third paragraph, the second full paragraph. So here we go. If British authorities truly hoped to isolate Boston, they realized quickly how badly they had misjudged the situation. Sounds like an ongoing thing with the Brits, doesn't it? The king, having originally urged that the tea duty be repealed, reluctantly concluded that, quote, the colonists must either triumph or submit, confirming Woodrow Wilson's estimate that King George III had, quote, too small a mind to rule an empire. Now, I don't know how often I want to quote Wilson, but that's a pretty good quote. But, you know, as we'll see, Wilson was a real dodge pickle. All right. Intending to force compliance, Britain dispatched General Thomas Gage and 4 regiments of redcoats to Massachusetts. Gage was a tragic figure. He proved unrelenting in his enforcement methods, generating still more colonial opposition. Yet he operated within a code of, quote, decency, moderation, liberty, and the rule of law, unquote. This sense of fairness and commitment to the law posed a disturbing dilemma for his objective of crushing the rebellion. The first united resistance by the colonists occurred in September 1774 when delegates to a Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in response to calls from both Massachusetts and Virginia. Delegates from every colony except Georgia arrived, displaying the widespread sympathy in the colonies for the position of Boston. Present were both Adamses from Massachusetts and Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and the indispensable man, George Washington, representing Virginia. Congress received a series of resolves from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, carried to the meeting by Paul Revere. The Suffolk resolves declared loyalty to the king, but scorned, quote, the hand which would ransack our pockets and the dagger to our bosoms. When Congress endorsed the Suffolk resolves, Lord Dartmouth, the British Secretary of State, warned, quote, the American people are generally ripe for the execution of any plan the Congress advises, should it be war itself. So he's saying, watch out, King. These people are ready to fight. You're getting them angry here. King George put it much more succinctly, stating, quote, "The die is cast." But of course, he was the one casting the die. No act of Congress was more symbolic of how far the colonies had come toward independence than the Galloway Plan of Union. Now, you remember, back in 1754, Benjamin Franklin had offered the Albany Plan of Union, the first plan of union in the United States, or in the colonies at that time. So now we have the Galloway Plan of Union. And let's see. Offered by Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, the plan proposed the establishment of a federal union for the colonies in America, headed by a president general appointed by the king and advised by a grand council whose representatives would be chosen by the colonial assemblies. Presented roughly 3 weeks after the Suffolk resolves, the Galloway Plan was rejected only after a long debate, with the final vote taken only in the absence of many of the advocates. In other words, if they'd waited a little longer, held the vote a little earlier, it might have passed. Still, it showed that the colonies already had started to consider their own semi-autonomous government. And once again, you see the colonists' willingness to keep the king, to pay homage to the king, to respect the king. This harkens back, does it not, to the Mayflower Compact, where they say, "Oh, great king, buddy, pal, man, we love you," right? They're trying everything they can to stay within the British Empire, but the farmer king's not having a whole lot of it. Now, ready for this? I don't care what edition you're reading from. This is brand new stuff. This is revised material that I will be including within the book when I put out the revised edition later this summer. So here's how this is going to work. Since I can't go in and actually revise the PDF with the publisher, I will have inserts throughout. And I will say, insert this after such and such a line, or before the first paragraph, or whatever. So if you had this, if this was already out later this summer, this is going right before the header, Revolutionary Ideas. So this is new material that you aren't reading. All right, here we go. And the header is, "How radical was the revolution?" That's the header for this new section. America's revolution involved a social transformation as well as political, with extensive and radical changes occurring. According to historian Gordon Wood, who I think is probably the best historian of this period, no matter what that idiot Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, those guys say in Good Will Hunting, they're morons. Howard Zinn's a poof bubble. But Gordon Wood's the guy. If you ever want to check out anything on the American Revolutionary era, Middlecoff and Gordon Wood are the two names you want to go to right off the bat. Historian Gordon Wood, the radicalism of the 18th century idea that all men were created equal could not be appreciated without understanding that the tradition at the time was difference and deference among orders. Reputation became extremely important, which is why insults, even in newspapers, could lead to duels. The reputation of a man was everything. However, gentlemen only needed to respond to other gentlemen and could ignore inferiors. So if you're a nobody, you can hurl insults at Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson or anybody else all day long, and it won't matter because you're a nobody. You're not a gentleman. But if you're the gentleman class, you've got to be careful. It's almost like Japanese Bushido. You know, you say the wrong insult and you're going to have to get out the samurai swords. War offered rapid opportunities to achieve honor and advance a reputation. This in turn affected society as a whole, as colonial governments lacked coercive powers of modern states. Sheriffs, mayors, and other officials could not force anyone to do anything, but rather had to rely on, quote, social respectability and private influence to compel the obedience of ordinary people. And the citation here is Gordon Wood's Radicalization of the American Revolution, page 85. Virtue and independence, i.e. not being dependent on anyone, were deeply intertwined in the American mind. Most colonists in practice did not see much difference between slavery and indenturism, whereby men did not own land. So the key here was land ownership, not necessarily the terms of your contract. Because an indenture who didn't own land was no more to them than a slave. Most colonists in practice did not see any difference between slavery and indenturism, whereby men did not own land. James Wilson observed that dependence involved the obligation by the inferior to conform to the will of the superior upon whom he depended. And that's also from Wood, page 56. Liberty took on a new meaning. It wasn't merely license. Didn't mean just do whatever you wanted. Rather, it was, quote, realized when the citizens were virtuous, that is, willing to sacrifice their private interests for the sake of community. So liberty is very much like what Jesus preaches in the Bible, which is meekness. Now, that term meekness in the Bible is often misunderstood. It does not mean weakness. It doesn't mean, oh, you can't do anything. No, it means you've got full authority and power to do whatever you want. But you, out of obedience, are restraining yourself and not doing that. And that is the same principle being used by these colonists, that true liberty meant you were free to do basically whatever you want, but you policed yourself, okay? You controlled yourself, self-control, and you did what was not only in your best interest, but also in the best interest of society as a whole. And that's from page 104. Note that this is similar to socialism, except one accomplishes the end through choice in this system, the other through force. Both the loss of independence and virtue were seen as corruption. So independence, freedom, and virtue are seen as two sides of the same coin by the colonists. You can't have one without the other. This is why that famous quote, I think is by Adams, who said that this government that they created was meant entirely for a religious people who's following God, and it's not going to work unless you have that mindset behind the government. Citizens of the late 1700s were so consumed by the character of their leaders because the leaders were the source of despotism. And despite discussions of checks and balances, the best protection against despotism was to ensure that only men of good character wielded power. Wealthy men saw public service as a form of a tax. Are you ready for that? A tax on them to serve the people at their own purpose. So a little editorializing here. This is why it's very important to look at what people accomplish and not just statements they make from time to time. And I'll refer here to President Trump. He came into the presidency with a lot of cargo, a lot of baggage about personal behavior, but his actual moral fiber showed up in his presidency when, number one, first and foremost, he kept his word on almost everything. The only things he couldn't keep his word on were those things that Congress would not work with him to fix, like the wall. But wherever he possibly could, he kept every single campaign promise. Now, you go back and you name me another president, even going back to Reagan, who did that. Reagan kept some of them, but he didn't shrink government. But Trump kept or tried to keep every single promise. So right there is character. May not be the same kind of character you thought of when you were talking about how many divorces he had or something like that. See, but this is a measure of character. Does a man do what he says he's going to do? Does he follow through? Okay. Faith without works is dead. Right. So these guys are saying you've got to judge character very carefully, because all government tends toward despotism. And if you don't get the right guys in there, you're going to get despots, because automatically that's what they do. All right. And wealthy men viewed it as their service. They actually viewed it as a tax to go serve people, because they were losing money while they were serving the public. You ready for that? Name me one person in public life who has lost money in government service in the past 100 years. It'll go back to Harry Truman. I don't think Harry Truman made a dime while he was in the presidency, but everybody else did, except Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost about $1 billion while he was president. And you look at other people like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and they go in with, personal wealth in like maybe $1 million or something. They come out in hundreds of millions of dollars because they're paid for their name and so on and so forth. So this idea that service is a tax is very relevant to us today. The structure held until the early 19th century growth, when early 19th century growth broke up communities, forcing the substitution of legal and intermediary forms such as checks and promissory notes for personal character relationship. In other words, you could say to somebody that you owed money to, and I've got some friends like this today. If I say, Bill, would you lend me some money? I've got a project I want to do. I'll pay you back. Sure. I know where you live. It's a joke. I know where you live. No problem. Not a word. Other people, Larry, I'm going to pay you back. Sure. I don't worry about it. You're going to do it. But when you start getting communities that are bigger, so people don't know others intimately or, very, very well, can't trust their character, you need other means by which you can guarantee the relationships, by which you can say, how do I know he's going to pay me back? Well, I have a promissory note. I have a loan agreement. And if need be, I can take it to court. See, court should be the last resort. Ironically, it was Arthur and Lewis Tappan who, through correspondent relationships with mercantile establishments, developed a sort of handy guide to character via reports from individuals around the country. Later, their company was called Dun and Bradstreet. This is a very interesting story. They were abolitionists, and they were also busybodies. They were churchgoers, very religious men, but they wanted the rest of society to be equally religious. So they formed a network in New York of spies, kind of moral police, who would go around and report, well, there's a gambling parlor over here, or there's a brothel over here. And the Tappans would find ways to try and shut these things down. Well, they got in trouble in the Panic of 1837. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, Tappan was almost broke, and he had to do what I've just been saying, go to all of his creditors, say, I can't pay you now, I'll pay you later, right? Now, in the meantime, both brothers became fervent abolitionists. And abolitionism is a specific term, as we will see later, but I'll just give this to you now. Abolitionism means immediate and total emancipation of all slaves. There was nothing gradual about it, nothing political about it, nothing structural. Let's set up a structure that will get rid of slavery. It was, let's do it right now. And so to them, it was like salvation. This is why all the abolitionist literature and Battle Hymn of the Republic, very much a religiously toned song. And so for them, it was an immediate thing. And so as they got into trouble, and as people who were still in favor of slavery saw them as troublemakers and tried to burn down their house and so forth, and they had all of these creditors who couldn't pay their bills, and they couldn't pay their bills, they decided that this spy network might be a good idea if put to a different use. What if you could rely on people in different cities around the country to go around and tell you and report in letters who was and who wasn't a good credit risk, a reference? And so they enlisted all of these correspondents around the country. And these people would write in and say, well, there's this guy, Ulysses Grant, actual report, and all he's got is a good wife and a barrel with a board over it for his table, but he's a good character. He has good character. He's as good as gold. And another correspondent was Abraham Lincoln, who was a very good judge of men. And so you get these letters coming in, and the Tappans had what they called the mercantile agency, through which they loaned money. And they would decide who to loan to by virtue of these credit references. Now, of course, today's liberals would freak out. Well, what if you don't like somebody? What if you don't like the color of their skin? Well, what if you don't get along with the correspondent? Well, yeah, that's a risk. That's a risk. But then a good businessman will develop correspondence with different skin colors, in different ethnic groups, in different parts of the city, so that if somebody comes to you from, let's say, East St. Louis today, you'd have a good reference as to whether or not this is somebody you should lend money to. So it's very interesting how the personal webs of trust in people's character gave way to less reliable and more rigid structures of applications and loans. And every time you have to paper something over and make it very rigid, you're going to lose a lot of good people who don't qualify for the paper, right? As soon as you set up a bar exam for lawyers, you're going to lose a lot of good lawyers who might not qualify. Lincoln didn't pass the bar. Okay. I know you don't want to think about this, but there's probably some doctors out there who could be pretty good doctors and never pass the medical boards because they're intuitive and they understand stuff intuitively. Now, of course, we would want them all to be as knowledgeable and as educated as you could possibly be. All I'm saying is whenever you put up barriers to exclude people, which is what applications processes are, you're by nature going to exclude a lot of very good people. All right. Oh, the mercantile agency became Dun and Bradstreet. These concepts of freedom and virtue even bled into insurance ventures, where in the case of the Thomas McCargo v. New Orleans Insurance Company regarding slave insurance disputes, the result was an articulation of freedom in the commercial sense as being unfree if another man owned your risk, while you were truly free only if you owned your own risk. Isn't that interesting? That if you were insured by someone else and he owned your risk, you weren't free because you couldn't do things that you wanted to do. It kind of gets down to the debate we've always had about seatbelts in cars. I wear my seatbelt all the time. I think you're crazy if you don't, but I don't think we should have a law requiring you to. Same thing in motorcycle helmets. If you're nuts enough to get on a motorcycle without a helmet, see you in the hospital. Okay. And this last concept is from a book by Jonathan Levy called Freaks of Fortune, The Emerging World of Capitalism and Risk in America. It's a 2012 book from Harvard Press, page 49. Over the course of about 15 years, British policy found a way to threaten almost every colonist Republican's values, threats that soon produced a great social antagonism, not of rich versus poor, or even Democrats versus aristocrats, but of patriots versus a courtier class. In the 21st century, this would be recast as the country class versus the ruling class, which is what we have today, the country class versus the ruling class. That is the elites in Washington versus not just Washington, but in almost every city and state government versus everybody else. They know what's better for you. Thus, when George Washington resigned as commander of the American forces after the Revolution, it was a masterful demonstration of the very principle of patriot over courtier. At the same time, in an equally crucial transformation, productive labor was valued and cherished as a badge of honor, while aristocrats were seen with contempt. Revolutionary America's culture that had previously allowed not only slavery, but other forms of bondage and unfreedom, again, indentured servitude, suddenly and effectively ended. Quote, liberty, wrote Algernon Sidney, quote, solely consists in independency upon the will of another. And this is again from Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. Intellectually, then, the defense of slavery amid such radical rhetoric and thinking could not survive long. So again, that was an addition for you from the new material that will be added in the updated and revised versions coming out later this summer. Okay, we continue with the book itself on page 76 and revolutionary ideas. Let me see, we can't get to Lexington today. We'll take a little bit of this though. In October 1774, the First Continental Congress adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, 12 resolutions stating the rights of the colonists in the empire. Among the resolutions was a statement of the rights of Americans to, quote, life, liberty, and property, secured by the principles of the British Constitution, the unchanging laws of nature, and the colonial charters. Isn't it interesting that Thomas Jefferson, the so-called deist, adds to that phrase the laws of nature and what? Nature's God. So I believe Jefferson knew that God existed. I don't think he wanted to admit it, but I believe he knew it. Where had the colonists gotten such concepts? Three major Englishmen and Enlightenment thinkers deeply affected the concepts of liberty. I've talked a little bit about these guys before. And government held by the majority of American revolutionary leaders. Certainly all writers had not read the same European authors, and certainly all were affected by different ideas to different degrees, often depending on the relationship any given writer placed on the role of God in human affairs. Nevertheless, the overall molding of America's revolution in the ideological sense can be traced to the theories of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and the Baron Charles de Montesquieu. Hobbes, as I said earlier, the English writer in the mid-1600s, was a supporter of the monarchy. In his book, The Leviathan, 1661, Hobbes described an ancient, even prehistoric, quote, state of nature in which man was, quote, at war with every other man, unquote, and life was, as I said before, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape these circumstances, man created the civil state or government, in which people gave up all other rights to receive protection from the monarch. As long as the government delivered its subjects from the, quote, fear of violent death, it could place on them any other burdens or infringe on any other rights. From Hobbes, therefore, the revolutionary writers took the concept of right to life that infused virtually all the subsequent writings. Another Englishman, John Locke, writing under much different circumstances, agreed with Hobbes that a state of nature once existed, but differed totally as to its character. Locke's state of nature was beautiful and virtually sinless, but somehow man had fallen out of that state, and to protect his rights entered into a social compact or a civil government. It is significant that both Hobbes and Locke departed substantially from the classical Greek and Roman thinkers, including Aristotle, who held that government was a natural condition of man. To both Hobbes and Locke, it's artificial. Both Hobbes and Locke saw government as artificial, created by man rather than natural to man. Locke, writing in his second treatise on government, described the most desirable government as one that protected human, quote, life, liberty, and estate. You see where we get this stuff. Therefore, government should be limited. It should only be strong enough to protect these three inalienable rights. From Locke, then, the revolutionary writers took the phrase right to liberty as well as to property. Hobbes and Locke, therefore, had laid the groundwork for the Declaration of the rights and grievances, and later the Declaration of Independence, which contained such principles as the limitations on the rights of the government and rule by consent of the governed. All that remained was to determine how best to guarantee those rights, an issue considered by a French aristocrat, Charles de Montesquieu. In a book called The Spirit of the Laws, drawing largely on his admiration for the British constitutional system, Montesquieu suggested dividing the authority of the government among various branches with different functions, providing a blueprint for the future government of the United States. While some of the creme de la creme in American political circles read or studied Locke or Hobbes, most Virginia and Massachusetts lawyers were common attorneys dealing with property and personal rights in society, not in abstract theory. Still, ideas do seep through, thanks to the American love of newspapers, pamphlets, and oral debate and informal political discussion. By 1775, many of the revolutionaries, whether they realized it or not, sounded like John Locke and his disciples. All right, that's a good place to stop. We've had a pretty good discussion. I hope you enjoyed the new material. That's a bonus for you today. Remember that this is brought to you by the Wild World of History, and check it out. There's tons of free stuff there. You got to poke around a little bit, look under blogs, look under some of the articles, but there's all sorts of free stuff for kids there. Actually, a lot of this is stuff we had to pull out of Patriot's history when we wrote it because it was just so darn long. So take a look at that. Take a look at the lessons. Take a look at the history VIP. You will love the VIP. You get access to more than 40 of my webcasts over the last 3 years, where I took on every subject from UFOs in history to the Crusades, from the Kennedy assassination to the Winged Hussars. I mean, everything like that. So check it out. Also, remember, buy me a coffee. Let's turn this book into a fantastic video series. Watch the trailer on the website. And when you love it, have a hanky, you're going to cry. And when you love it, buy me a coffee, buy me 10. And I'll see you guys back here on Friday.